they're doing social engineering. They're exploiting people. And now we've created an entire classification of computers that can be socially engineered.
Welcome to the Threat Intelligence Podcast, Episode 1.
Claim versus reality, once the technology starts to play out, is always so radically different.
This podcast features Bryan Nakayama and Rachel James and their work with OWASP Gen AI, as they are the volunteer leads in the AI Threat Intelligence Initiative. The opinions expressed in this podcast are theirs and theirs alone, and do not reflect the opinions of the organizations through which they are employed. My name is Dave Hatt, and I'm the host facilitator of the podcast. I know you both well enough that I can confidently characterize you both as being humble. And so to that end, to launch this podcast series, I'd like for each to take this opportunity to introduce the other person to our listeners. And Rachel, I would like for you to be so kind as to start and to introduce Bryan.
I've noticed you don't often use the doctor honorific. Is there a reason for that? Should I not refer to you as Dr. Bryan Nakayama?
I don't want to be on an airplane and, people think that there's a doctor on board, right? You can call me Dr. Bryan. Actually, don't call me Dr. Bryan. When I was a professor, I would always tell students, don't call me Dr. Bryan. Inevitably, someone would. You can call me doctor if you like, but I guess speaking of humble, it's part of a different life.
All right. But Bryan and I met because he was doing some cyber threat intelligence, structured analytical techniques, really looking at how we take a methodical approach to prioritizing threat actor activity as it applies to a specific company. So I saw his presentation about this, and it was all the things that sort of are near and dear to my heart. It was based off of the scientific method. It was a repeatable methodology that it could be extensible to multiple different organizations. And so in that space, we were working in Health ISAC as volunteers. And I was co-leading a cyber threat intelligence program development group at the time. And I said, man, this is the guy that we need in order to really superpower some of the work that we're doing in this area, and trying to help a lot of healthcare institutions understand what a cyber threat intelligence program is, how to mature it, what are the foundational talents and skills and tools that you need for that. And so Bryan and I got to work pretty extensively on this. And as we were working with some of the different techniques that you encounter when you're doing cyber threat intelligence are things like using natural language processing to analyze sentiment, to look at basically a lot of threat actor chatter, a lot of different types of reports, and be able to measure that in an analytical way. And so that was kind of the first place for me where maybe some of my cyber threat intelligence activities started to brush up against some of the same concepts that would eventually lead to Gen AI and large language models, and the place that those hold inside of cybersecurity applications. So I was asked to come over and work on the OWASP Top 10 Gen AI security project as a core team member. And when there were a lot of discussion that was happening around what does this mean if this type of technology is in the hands of threat actors? What does this mean about our threat landscape? I said, oh, you know what? I know just the person that we need in order to lead an entire initiative, which we call the Threat Intelligence Initiative today. Because he's going to bring a lot of this methodical process, this way that we can analyze data on it and conduct research in a really methodical way to answer some of these core questions. So I went to Bryan and I said, come on, there's a whole pile of work over here, and I really would love to have you join me doing it. And very thankfully, he has now been a part of OWASP for a number of years, helping me co-lead that threat intelligence initiative. So Bryan's background is actually academically literally in this space, was around studying the way emerging technologies had an effect on innovative novel threats in a geopolitical landscape. So his academic background could not be a better fit for what we needed in the types of research that we were going to be conducted. And especially now, as we see increasingly how AI and cyber threat activity has an overlap with the kinetic warfare space and a geopolitical landscape.
On that incredibly intense note, Bryan, off to you to introduce Rachel, and then we'll come back afterwards and we'll get into a little bit of the OWASP Gen AI as your work there. Rachel
is both a friend and a collaborator, right? We've been working together for a long time, and I think it really kind of shows the power of the cybersecurity community, right? People frequently like to say cybersecurity is a small world. People who work on AI and cybersecurity, if that's a small world, that's like a tiny world. It's microscopic, right? And so, as Rachel mentioned, we met through Health Isaac, finding points of collaboration together, and I think have had, kind of very productive research into trying to think about the threat intelligence dimensions of generative AI, as to where Rachel comes from. I think, she'd tell you very long and storied background, bouncing between many different aspects of cybersecurity. I'll also add, speaking of humble, she's literally a hero in the healthcare cybersecurity community. And I mean that in the sense that she won the Stephen Katz Hero Award from Health Isaac, right? I believe was it like a year and a half ago or something like that. And so, just someone who has made immense contributions to healthcare cybersecurity and has been so kind as to, kind of help me out, particularly as I transitioned into a new career and help me find my kind of footing in community. So much appreciated, just endlessly, nice things to say. But I hope that kind of captures it in just a few moments.
Yeah, it was very nice of you, Bryan, for sure. And I think too, one of the kind of combinations that we bring is I do have an offensive security background and a cyber threat intelligence background. Bryan has a fantastic research structure background, analytical structure background, and deep threat intelligence perspective, and is a geopolitical background that I don't have. And I think the combination of that and the way we work together, our combination of our viewpoints ends up being something that's usually surprising to the both of us.
So you mentioned, Bryan, used a really interesting term, and I keyed in on it. Small world in terms of people that work in your field, but it's massive implications, right? The implications of the work that you do and what you see are massive. So it's a good point to jump off and to talk a little bit about the work that you both do and why you do it for OWASP Gen AI and what the goal is in working with this organization.
So I think we have roughly, I think best to divide it up into 3 work streams. One, which is more kind of traditional threat intelligence, which is trying to look at the broad landscape. How are threat actors using and abusing generative AI? The second is original threat research, such as the Exploit Research Project. And Rachel, I'll let you kind of fill in what exactly is going on with that now, previous, efforts, that sort of thing. And then the third work stream, which I do a lot of work with, is basically trying to provide practical guidance to cybersecurity practitioners, right? So to that end, we have an AI incident response guide, right? Which we will be doing an update towards soon, as well as a deepfake incident guide, right? Trying to give practical advice to security practitioners. Okay, your boss is telling you, put Gen AI everywhere. Well, how are you going to secure that? What sorts of things do you need to think about? What do you do when you're faced with a deepfake incident? That sort of thing. So the CTI initiative tries to provide resources across those 3 different streams, right? Again, threat landscape, second, original threat research, and then third, guidance to security practitioners.
Yeah, and I think it's important, the reason we decided that, the deepfake guide, the incident response guide was so important under our threat intelligence initiative was that we really wanted to make sure things were threat intelligence led. Because one of the things Bryan and I both saw early on in this space, Bryan and I both often say we have like an allergy to BS, right? And what we were seeing was a lot of buzzword grabbing headlines and like a lot of like sort of panic reporting. When you dug under the covers just a little bit, it wasn't actual threat actor activity. These were researchers. These were cybersecurity people who were trying to hypothetically create conditions. There was a lot of difficulty telling what is the difference between the absolute truth of the threats we're facing today, how threat actors are actually using this technology, the actual conditions that they potentially could be like weaponizing AI to use in a vulnerability discovery and exploitation versus the ideal conditions that might be being created by a vendor who's trying to sell a product, or a security researcher who's getting funding from a lab in order to like create sort of the ideal conditions to make something that would be create findings that would be sensational headlines. And so we really wanted to make sure that there was like a place where you could separate that out and understand actual threat actor activity and prioritize it.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's funny. That's one place where I found my academic research actually kind of came in really helpful, right? Is, I looked at, basically 120 years of pronouncements about this technology is going to change everything, from radio creating a global democracy without government, to we'll have lunar bases by 1970, to cyber war cyber capabilities are the ultimate weapon akin to nuclear weapons. And something consistently is that claim versus reality, once the technology starts to play out, is always so radically different, right? The view from when a technology first starts proliferating to when it's actually being integrated into actual processes, becomes a security threat, right? There's a huge gap between those. And so I think something that's helpful is it kind of like inoculated me against a lot of hype, where I'm just kind of like, I've heard this before, right? You're telling me that this changes everything?
Yeah, and this perspective that you brought to like being able to like read a research study and like talk about the actual like way the study was constructed was what led to our research stream around AI ability to do exploitation. Because what Bryan and I were sharing with each other at the time was a bunch of articles that were like, yeah, AI, and this was well before Mythos or any of the sort of current, this was like almost 2 years ago at this point. AI is going to like make it so script kiddies can hack the Pentagon and they can discover 0 days, and it was like sky is falling. But then I would send these to Bryan. I'm like, this is so weird to me, Bryan, because these people are saying this, but I'm doing a bunch of counterintelligence research and looking at the way threat actors are actually discussing this technology. And especially at the time, if you came into a lot of hacker forums and you were like, yeah, I'm going to use AI to like make malware code, there were like, you would get laughed at, like you would literally get made fun of by other threat actors. They largely considered, and accurately at the time, at the capabilities they viewed AI as really unsuitable for generating malware, for doing much more than like phishing, right? And so I said to Bryan, I was like, I'm like having trouble like marrying these two worlds. And Bryan like looked at the research and he's like, well, it's interesting. Like look at the date of the research and the model cutoff date and the assumptions that they've put into this. And we started really looking at the time the way this research was being constructed, and we said this is like very intentionally sort of designed to be able to get findings that does not represent the way hackers would actually be encountering 0 days in the real world. How could we construct research better with how we know actual enterprise environments operate, how threat actors actually do the reconnaissance and the attacking, and how they actually would be and have been observed to use AI? Could we construct this research better? And we did a ton of searching at the time. We were really hoping smarter people with more resources than us had maybe already started down this path. And at the time, it being a small Venn diagram, right? The people who have the cybersecurity knowledge, who have the pen testing background, the cyber threat intelligence background, and the people who knew enough about AI in order to actually harness that was so tiny that we realized, actually, no, this group in OWASP, the people that we have volunteering, the people who are part of our threat intelligence initiative, we are the bleeding edge here. We are the ones actually the most capable of constructing this type of research. And now we've been doing that research. We're in phase 2, and we've been doing that research now for almost 2 years.
Because I think that's the kind of benefit of the OWASP as an open source organization, right? Is that on the one hand, you have security vendors who want to sell you something. So I just remember reading an article 2 years ago that's like, AI changes everything. And you read the article and it's that the author was able to write a convincing phishing email using like ChatGPT. And you're just like, wow, you're telling me you can write a convincing phishing? Does this really change everything? Right? So vendors want to sell you something. the model providers have a vested interest in saying, like, our model is going to end the world, right? Because then that inflates their perspective. And then, academic researchers also have the incentive to demonstrate, given enough resources, right, that we can get X, Y, and Z results out of a model, right? And I think, that kind of independence, being an open source organization, we're here because of our passion, kind of remove some of those financial incentives. And also, the fact that we care about, okay, what does this actually look like in practice, as opposed to in theory, right? What's possible? More question, what's probable? Why are threat actors using this? When might they adopt it? What sort of incentive structure do they face? And so, again, I think that's the kind of big benefit of our independence, right? Is our ability to kind of like cut through a lot of the kind of other incentives that other researchers in this space have.
So taking into account that the OWASP Gen AI as an organization, its goal is security and adoption through application systems and best practices. How does this podcast fit, and to whom are we targeting this podcast series moving forward? So if we were to say, these are the people that we want to attract, the earballs that we want to attract to this podcast, maybe you guys could expand on that.
Yeah, I could take a first crack at this. I would say, first and foremost, people who have the same allergy to BS, right? People who really recognize that this space is incredibly flooded with a lot of information coming from a lot of people who have their own biases, who have their own motivations, and are really looking for a source where all of those different viewpoints, all of those different sources of reporting have been put through a structured analytical technique in order for us to be able to discuss really what is the ground truth, operative reality that affects you, your organization, and the threat landscape that you're operating in. You can get a bunch of information from a million different sources. You can set up Google alerts to just be inundated with the fire hose. But if you're looking for some place that is thoughtfully dissecting the way that these conclusions or the research articles are being done, and what is it that's the key takeaway you need to make as a decision maker, as an engineer, as a security operator, that is going to actually affect the way you are moving forward with your world, this is a great place to do this. It's a great place to cut through a lot of that noise and be able to get down to, like, what is the operational ground truth that I need to know in order to be able to protect my organization, protect my data, protect my assets. Bryan?
Yeah, we don't care about the BS. We'll tell you what we really think, right?
Yeah.
That's how I'd sum it up. Is that, we'll give kind of honest assessments that are rooted in real thinking about how actors behave, their incentive structures, and the constraints that they face. And I think, again, I think constraints is something that a lot of AI prognosticators never think about in terms of threat actor activity, is cost. Why would they adopt this? Technical barriers to adoption, that sort of thing. That's something that, again, we kind of explore in other venues, and we'll bring that perspective here, right? Which is one that isn't centered on trying to sell you something, that isn't trying to inflate, before an IPO, one that, really tries to, again, gives you the best, most honest assessment of what's happening.
So to wrap up this pilot episode, I've got one question that I'd like to ask, and I'll have Bryan answer it first and then Rachel. When did you both realize that Gen AI was going to be critical for cybersecurity?
That's a great question. And it's funny, I kind of came to it through information operations, right? Which is not exactly the same as cybersecurity, but is very similar, right? And so actually before ChatGPT was released, I was actually doing work as an academic with AI security researchers, basically trying to understand the implications for international competition between the US and China around AI. And one of those things that I really realized this moment, where I was like reading an article that someone had kind of tested the production of, was, thinking to myself, oh my goodness, this is going to, enable industrial scale disinformation. And so as I moved into a cybersecurity role that, little less disinformation, I started to think about the industrial scale production of potentially malware, other things like that, the ability to produce, again, at scale code that could be malicious. And now, I have different feelings about it, but again, that kind of, way in which AI can be a force multiplier, right? By allowing you to produce so much more quickly. Again, I have a much more nuanced view on that, but it was funny. It was It was even before ChatGPT that I was starting to think about this. And that's just because I got lucky and got to talk to AI researchers before they became, celebrities, basically.
For me, I think I came through this, again, through a cyber threat intelligence lens. So I was doing a fair amount of work around natural language processing and sentiment analysis. And sentiment analysis, when you start to really work with the technology, it really is. This is always like mind blowing to me. I always get a little bit giddy when I explain this to people. But the sentiment analysis and the understanding the semantic relationships between words, which is how large language models operate, fundamentally what you're doing with that technology is you're reducing human language to a mathematical representation of the way words relate to each other. Like, if you had a scale of, say, age and gender, right, you would say, like, on the gender scale of male, female, over on the male side, we have boy and man, but boy is on a younger side of that relationship than man. And all of these sort of like relationships, king, queen, like between the words that we use, have these like mathematical vector relationships. And so when I was doing sentiment analysis with natural language processing, I was fascinated by the fact that all human language works like this. All human language can be reduced to like a vector space of semantic relationships between words. And when I first was hearing about large language models that were being used to craft phishing emails, the moment that I peeked under the cover and I was like, what does this really mean with a large language model? What does generative AI mean as opposed to machine learning and deep learning concepts that I'd already been applying in a natural language processing context? I immediately understood, like, oh, it is this vectorization of the semantic relationships between words and how that generative space is influenced by the words that you use. And so for me, what I picked up on instantly, and why I'm now the prompt injection entry lead for the top 10, is that we've essentially made with large language models, is we've essentially made socially engineerable computers. And from a cybersecurity standpoint, that was fascinating to me because for a long, long time, cybersecurity people have said the greatest, weakest link that we have is humans. And we know now that like a lot of our current day breaches are fileless. They're not being done with malware. They're not necessarily being done by exploiting a vulnerability. They're doing social engineering. They're exploiting people. And now we've created an entire classification of computers that can be socially engineered. And so that just really hit me with like a ton of bricks, right? And it's interesting when I go and I talk at cybersecurity conferences about the way prompt injection works and the fact that prompt injection experts largely believe we can never get rid of it because it's endemic to how the model is designed. And I say that means we now have socially engineerable computers. You can hear the audible gasp in the audience where like people realize what that actually means to a whole new world of implication for us as cybersecurity practitioners. So that was kind of the first like real ton of bricks that hit me, realizing how much this was going to change everything about the way we think about computers. We have always been dealing with deterministic expert rule-based computing until now. And now we have a socially engineerable, non-deterministic computer system that people are increasingly inserting into very critical workflows. And that has a huge implication on basically the whole world of how we've built cybersecurity, because we didn't build our world for this type of computer. So it's really interesting.
Thanks for listening. Like, follow, and subscribe wherever you get your favorite podcasts. Thanks to Rachel James and Bryan Nakayama for this great information. Catch them on the next episode of the Threat Intelligence Podcast. Scott Clinton is executive producer for OWASP Gen AI, and my name is Dave Hatt. I'm executive producer for Rum Runner Media.